Welcome back to part two of lecture 9 on NAFTA. So now we'll discuss the replacement of NAFTA, which we've previously mentioned goes by many names depending on where you are. But for Canada, it's called CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. But we can also refer to this as NAFTA 2.0. In the United States, it's called USMCA, as we mentioned prior, but we can make it easier and call it NAFTA 2.0. So while NAFTA had some major plus sides, as we discussed, namely a rise in trade, allowing billions of dollars in value, adding billions of dollars of value, and improving the conditions in some pockets of Mexico, not all parts, I should say, again, and we can look at such uprisings as the Zapatistas in Mexico, which rejected this agreement and the harms it claimed it inflicted on the population of Mexico, specifically the indigenous population. So there were also many downsides, a whole host of downsides to this agreement that we can scrutinize and unpack a little bit. One of the biggest critics of NAFTA was Donald Trump. As he got closer to the presidency and hit on popular themes amongst his constituents, specifically in what's called the Rust Belt, the Northeast United States. Trump played on this support from this base of support from the Rust Belt and targeted NAFTA and the factories and jobs lost in places such as Michigan, where the auto sector lost out a lot due to NAFTA, as well as Ohio in the manufacturing sector, Wisconsin in the manufacturing sector, Pennsylvania in the steel sector. So these are the places that Trump made such strong anti-NAFTA arguments, which were also crucial states for the Republicans to win in the 2016 presidential election. The United States electoral system is a little different than Canada's, so if you're curious about how this works, you can look into the U.S. Electoral system to kind of unpack why it's so important that Trump won these specific states. Trump also bemoaned a trade deficit, which he saw as hurting the United States. Typically, a trade deficit doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing for a particular economy because it means lower prices for consumers. But Trump saw this as meaning that the US was losing global trade as it was importing more than it was producing and exporting. That's what a trade deficit refers to. But this didn't acknowledge really the fact that more consumption on the part of Americans is also sometimes regarded as a sign of economic strength, as consumers had resources to buy these goods and services. So the fact that it's importing more is not necessarily a bad thing because it means the consumer base of the United States is quite strong still. Trump felt that the United States as a whole, as well as the US worker, was being taken advantage of, and that NAFTA was hurting the United States and helping Mexico. And that many companies, such as Carrier, which is an air conditioning company out of Indiana, was moving to Mexico for cheaper labor, leading him to threaten these companies, making all these kind of blustering threats to these companies that were shifting their production to Mexico due to the low labor costs. And he was saying that these companies were increasingly profitable, meanwhile the U.S. workers specifically was not benefiting. So Trump, once in office, notified Mexico and Canada that he was going to rip up the NAFTA agreement and that he would have to create a new agreement. And this was done by Trump as a means to move production back to the United States. However, this did not really work on a grand scale. The Mexican state responded by wishing to join a new agreement immediately. Canada did not respond with the same level of eagerness immediately. Canada was worried that being left out of an agreement would seriously harm the Canadian economy. And it was clear that the US was using its hard power, where Canada was forced into this particular arrangement out of fear of jeopardizing its primary trading partner. However, by 2018, a new agreement was reached to replace NAFTA. It's replaced with an agreement with a name that depends, as we mentioned, on what country you live in. In the US, it's the USMCA. In Canada, it's CUSMA, and it can be effectively called NAFTA 2.0. In the end, in the end, the differences between the two agreements was quite negligible, and the new agreement looked much like the previous one. While Trump used the destruction of NAFTA and the creation of a new trade agreement for his political campaigning, many economists and experts have a very difficult time distinguishing the impacts of the new agreement under CUSMA versus the previous one under NAFTA. So it's uncertain, the ramifications of this change is sometimes overstated by Trump. Trump used this new agreement as part of his 2020 campaign, and it did not have much effect in reality. But a few things did change between NAFTA and CUSMA. Complaints about labor and environmental concerns will now be heard by panels of independent experts rather than delegates of other governments. Single violations in trade are punishable, whereas the current deals said they have to be sustained and reoccurring in order to invoke penalties under NAFTA. The new deal strengthens the enforcement of protections for freedom of association and collective bargaining in the workplace, with Canada and the United States establishing rapid response mechanisms. Burden of proof is reversed, so now it is presumed that a labor or environmental violation affects trade and investment and requires responding governments to prove otherwise. It installed the creation of an interagency committee that will monitor Mexico's labor reforms. It established key benchmarks for Mexico's labor reform implementation process. It enhanced the rules of origin, requiring any steel used in automaking to be melted and poured within the free trade zone of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, which is expected to benefit the steel industry in Canada and the United States. And it abandoned a provision that would have extended the protection for exclusivity on pharmaceutical biologics from 8 years to 10 years. I'm not expecting you to remember all of these, but these are just some of the major changes it invoked. The biggest concession for Canada, however, was the increase in US access to Canadian milk markets. We noted before, when we discussed the WTO, how agriculture is historically protected industry for many states, with the understanding that this sector of the national economy is particularly fragile to the transformations in trade and global economy. In Canada, milk is a protected status, and access to Canadian milk markets for foreign states is extremely difficult. The US, however, was able to convince Canada to allow for a higher percentage of the Canadian milk market to open to the Americans. Specifically in milk producing states such as Wisconsin, they can now access Canadian markets. Under the new agreement, Canada will provide US dairy farmers access to about 3.5% of its $16 billion annual domestic dairy market. This means that America will be able to access, to increase exports of some milk products into Canada. As mentioned, another major change is the higher percentage of materials in cars that must be made in North America. And it also argued for a higher minimum wage for Mexican auto workers, which would be done to remove the incentive for auto manufacturers in the United States and Canada to move production into Mexico because of the low labor costs. So raising the wages within Mexico is seen as a way of removing the incentive to move production into Mexico, and thus moving jobs further into Mexico where labor can be exploited at a much higher rate. There were also some changes in intellectual property rights, who could own patents and how long they could be held as well. Most importantly, the new agreement has what's called a sunset clause, where each party must re-examine the agreement every 6 years, and the deal expires in 16 years, so by 2034. All three sides could agree at this time to carry on. However, unlike NAFTA, which was designed to be permanent, this agreement formally expires in 16 years. If Canada, US, and Mexico wants to sign a free trade deal with any other state also, it must tell the other parties. So Canada cannot sign a free trade agreement with another state without telling the United States or Mexico what is in the deal. There's also greater transparency around currencies and more information sharing between the three states. There's also an agreement that there'll be less state ownership in the economy in all three states. But this is about all that changed between this agreement and NAFTA. And that's all that was accomplished after all the bluster raised by Trump and his administration about NAFTA and its failings. At the end of the day, it's clear to all parties that regional trade is something that's not going away anytime soon, especially in North America. So, some final thoughts. Not much has really changed, right? We're still very much in a NAFTA world. As we'll discuss in the next few weeks, the world is increasingly divided into large trading blocs. Even powerful states such as the United States requires NAFTA. There's a recognition from all these states that even the hegemonic states, when we say hegemonic, we mean the powerful states within world order, primarily the United States, they require trading blocs. They need international cooperation and trade. The US relies on Mexico and Canada. And it's clear that no state can really go it alone in the contemporary global political economy. And we're going to talk about this a little further when we talk about the European Union, that this is the gamble, this is part of the gamble, which we'll talk in the coming weeks, that the United Kingdom made in leaving the European Union with the decision for Brexit or exit from the European Union. And more we can see the consequences of such a decision and the negative impacts it can have on a particular state and economy. Many of these manufacturing jobs were going to leave the advanced, wealthy Western states in the period of globalization due to the advancements of technology and that increases the ease of shipping and growth in manufacturing in the global South. So despite NAFTA emerging, many of these tendencies that we see under NAFTA and the globalization of the world economy, these are things that were going to happen regardless of NAFTA. While minimum wages have had little substantial growth in recent decades, even in powerful Western liberal states, the wages are still much higher than those in labor markets around the world. And corporations have taken advantage of these low wages within a global economy, specifically in the global South. And this has been to the detriment of workers within the developing world who are exploited by mostly Western-centered corporations, multinational corporations, as well as a loss of jobs for the middle and lower classes in more wealthy Western societies. And this has led to a new backlash and rise of right-wing populism in many Western states. And Trump being the clearest example of this. But we see this with the decision for Brexit as well. We see this with the rise of Marine Le Pen in France. We see this with the rise of Viktor Orban in Hungary. What's another good example here? We see the rise of Salvini in Italy. So we can see that this is a tendency that's happening all over the place, and it's very much a backlash to these tendencies of globalization. We can see that these trading blocs are ways in which states can create unique relationships with key partners and allies that they do not wish to share with the rest of the world, as we discussed with the most favored nation status under the WTO. So we can see that these trading blocs are going to be just a reality of global political economy in the coming decades and further into the future. So some final thoughts also, that NAFTA and now NAFTA 2.0 was not as successful as it could have been and did not sufficiently protect workers and the economies of the members in the agreement. Nevertheless, it didn't make things necessarily worse than it would have been without it. And many of these tendencies would have continued regardless without NAFTA. In fact, NAFTA did actually protect society from these societies from certain aspects of globalization that could have been more disruptive to their economies and their societies. And NAFTA 2.0 contains some new features, as we've discussed, which helps mitigate some of these concerns. However, of course, not all of them. Trade agreements are quite popular with most of the public. However, there are some notable exceptions, as we mentioned with the Rust Belt. Um, Still, there's major flaws in NAFTA 2.0, namely poor enforcement and an imperfect dispute mechanism. And this could be due to the power inequalities between the states involved. Obviously, the US is the most powerful state within the agreement as well. While it's not perfect, Canada, the United States, and Mexico are stuck together, and the existence of this continental trading bloc is crucial for the future of all these nations. So there is, regardless of its issues, this is viewed as a crucial interest for all three states involved. So some things to think about. Will countries become closer economically? Will the three countries, it should say ever, get closer economically? Will NAFTA 2.0 lead to even closer integration between these states, or are we going to see a backlash where it makes states more divided? That's something to see in the future as well. Will these trade agreements lead to further integration, or will it lead to further disintegration because of this backlash between them? So will the societies become closer and closer to these trade relations? Will the politics of these states become more homogenous due to this closer integration? It's something to be seen in the future. Or will the politics be a politics of resentment like in Donald Trump and lead to further divisions? Could NAFTA become like the EU? Will it lead to a political integration where, like the European Union, states become politically integrated as well, not only economically? And then also, was NAFTA 2.0 worth it? After all, we've discussed, there were some changes, but at a base level, it remained very, very similar to the previous agreement. So was this whole shakeup and change worth it at the end of the day? That's a big question for those analyzing the new CUSMA USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 arrangement. Okay, and with that, I think that's all I have for you this week. I hope you all have a wonderful week. And please, again, let me know if you would like to have a one-on-one meeting with me. I'm going to be not hosting my regular office hours this week or next week. So if you'd like to speak with me, you'll have to make an appointment and just give me 3 time slots that work for you, and I'll choose one if it works for me. Please don't obviously choose 11:30 p.m. at night or 6:30 a.m. Keep it within reasonable work hours. But if you would like to discuss with me, please just send me an email and we can make an appointment. Without further ado, thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.